coming from Venezuela, we know the effects that, for example, these kind of processes can turn. So what I will speak about is the political effects of these kind of processes. Coming from a country like Venezuela, we don't have the luxury to debate monetary policy. We don't have the luxury that Europeans have, which is to have institutions where you can have dialogue, debate, where people have a shared interest to pursue the common good. On the contrary, in countries like mine, what we have is political and economic institutions who are basically to the service of kleptocrats, oligarchs, people who are using the state to pursue their own interests, people who are using the state to enrich themselves, even at the expense of putting millions of people to hunger, to misery, and to forced exile. And it is important that I begin highlighting this fact because inflation and economic mismanagement is not just an economic problem, it's a political problem. If Europe wants to preserve the democratic and peaceful institutions that you have, you need to have an economy that creates prosperity and opportunities for the people. What I believe is that there is a two-way relationship between political instability and economic performance. Because what is the problem with countries like mine? Is that you have democratic governments who encourage mismanagement. You have democratic governments who create economic problems. And that leads to populist and demagogue processes. People lose faith on the system. People lose faith of being represented by the political and economic institutions. So that leads to these processes such as the process of Hugo Chavez. Hugo Chavez was elected in 1998 in Venezuela under democratic rule, but then he became a dictatorship. And one of the ways he did it was through controlling the central bank and through imposing monetary policies that were financing his massive and crazy plans. So then what happens is that democracy becomes dismantled, becomes to deteriorate, problems begin to rise, and then you have politicians blaming corporate greed, you have politicians blaming business people for problems that they create. So the first thing that I want to say is that what we need to do is to counteract this narrative, the narrative that business people are the ones who create inflation in our countries. And this vicious cycle that is created when these countries go through this road is then very difficult to stop. So we need to stop them before they go too far. I would say that first, the issue of inflation has to also be seen from a moral perspective as well. We not only need to discuss the economic effects of having a country with high inflation rate, the inefficiencies that this brings to the table, but also the morality aspects. We need people, the dignity of people is in their hard labor, is in their savings, is in their salaries. And we need to protect these things. And we need institutions that protect these things. So first, I will try to give just 3 points, three recommendations to try to strengthen the European economy. And again, not only taking into consideration the performance and the efficiency of the single market, but also trying to enhance the political instability and the geopolitical position of the European Union as a whole. The first one is I will try to re-emphasize what Johan said before, is that we need monetary measures to improve the inflation rate. We need the ECB to continue its process of monetary tightening, aim at mitigating all the problems of low interest rates for so many years. And also, we need to continue the discontinuing of its assets purchasing program. But at the same time, this monster cannot be controlled if you don't have fiscal measures in the long term. Because the problem in all these processes is that the monetary policy is created to try to overcome the fiscal problems that all these countries have. So what we need to do in Europe is to then create some kind of fiscal tightening to these countries, because otherwise there will not be a solution. Where should inflation be? I think 2% maximum is the thing that what the empirics of economics says. And the second policy recommendation that I have is that from abroad, what I see is that it is incompatible to try to battle inflation and at the same time use the next generation European funds to incentivize short-term consumption. to me, it doesn't make any sense, because if you have these funds and these loans to incentivize short-term consumption and not use this fund to improve the structural aspects of the economy in the long run, then you are not really committed to battle inflation. What you are committed is to provide even more fiscal support to these kind of countries. And we already know that the external factors are going through. The energy crisis is fading away. So all these fiscal supports that countries have to mitigate these exogenous factors, they need to stop, because otherwise you will not be able to control inflation. As Barbara said, we need growth. In Europe specifically, we need productivity growth. For so many years and so many decades, growth, total factor productivity has been almost stagnant. So what we need to do, what I encourage people to do, is that we need to push for a different kind of notion of inequality. People used to see inequality from a consumption perspective. They say to see public policies as ways to address or to mitigate the differences in consumption between different sectors of society. This is a wrong way to see the issue. Inequality is indeed an issue, but what we need to do is to try to mitigate or to shorten the gap of inequality of productivity, of economic inclusion. And the way to do this is to create the infrastructure and the policies so that everybody joins the productive flow. We need to create the policies so that everybody has access to good jobs, quality jobs, with good infrastructure, with good public goods. And this is really the way to have a long-term viable European economy. The problem with places like mine is that you start subsidizing more and more the liabilities, and you start subsidizing more and more the consumption of people to the detriment of the productive flow and the productive economy. And when that happens and this process continues, then we know what are the results of that. So for the next gen loans and infrastructure, what I would hope the European Union would do is to incentivize this structural transformation that Europe needs. Because Europe definitely needs a transformation. Like coming from abroad, what I see is that you have all this capacity, you have all this potential, but the policies are in there stopping the people and stopping entrepreneurs with all the regulations and all the difficulties that they face. And the third element that I would like to emphasize is that we are living also in a new paradigm in terms of geopolitics. We saw it with Russia last year, but we also see this with China. And I think that this new economy that we're trying to build, this new economy that we're trying to design then in Europe, it also has to have an element of resilience. And how can we build this resilience? I do believe that, for example, the European Union has to find ways to mitigate the leverage that China has in the region. China likes to blackmail, likes to coerce countries for their political ideas. So we need to find ways that we all, at the European Union and abroad, that we join. I heard an interesting proposal, something called the Economic Article 5, which is similar to the NATO Article 5, but for economic matters, which basically means that we, democracies, we should find ways to protect each other from external attacks in the economic realm, which is something that China does on a consistent basis. China has done it with Australia, with the European Union, and with other partners. So something that I will encourage is the European Union to keep strengthening this. I have talked to people close to the European Commission that have mentioned me something called the anti-coercion instrument. I believe in that. I believe in this kind of geoeconomic tools that we can use to mitigate the problem that we have with China. And similarly, of course, continue decoupling with the Russian economy, continue decoupling with the Venezuelan economy, because I really believe that last year was a wake-up call that authoritarians are on the march, a wake-up call that dictators are emboldened, that they are forceful, and that they believe that they can win this battle between democracies and autocracies. And a central element to win this battle is us to have a strong economy, a united economy, an economy that provides jobs and opportunities to people. Because something that I see when I come to Europe is that many young people feel forgotten by the system. They don't have hope for the future. They see the state or Brussels too far away from them. And what we need to show them is that democracy and the European project is the best project that they can have. Because for me, from somebody who comes from Latin America, this is a beautiful project in which people can unite, in which cultures can become more interdependent, in which you have a single market, you don't have tariff, and you have created a space of collaboration where all of you in Europe have a single agenda. So we need to protect them. And one way to do it, honestly, is to rethink the way we see our economies. We don't want inflation. We don't want a state that subsidizes consumption to the point that it destroys the economy. And what we want is to find a ways that Europe is productive again, grows again. And that's why this panel is so important, because ultimately economy can change the lives of millions of people. When people, for example, leave hyperinflation, people left hyperinflation in my country in the millions, then their lives are completely destroyed. Their savings are destroyed, their salaries are destroyed, and that's not fair. That's not a just system. And the things that we are all, we are all advocating here is a system in which people have can enjoy the benefits of their work and can live a prosperous life. What I can say is that this is all about fiscal policy. Like, that's correct, because monetary policy in itself follows politics. And I think that's the dangers of it, is that we say that we have central banks who are independent and who are autonomous and all that. And all that is great in theory. However, what really ends up happening is that the central bank needs to follow what the fiscal policy is trying to do. So in Latin America, we always have these hyperinflationary processes because of the fiscal deficits from the central government. This process is exacerbated in countries like mine, where our source of revenue or fiscal revenue is so volatile, because in my country it's from oil revenues. So if you can see, when oil started to decline in 2014 and 2015, then our deficits, our budget deficits began to grow and grow. And the only way is to monetize the debt through monetary policy. So the central bankers are forced to do so, and it becomes a vicious cycle, because then the value of your currency goes down, your productive capacity also is affected by that. So in terms of the European Union, coming back to the topic, is that the only way that we can assure that we have financial and monetary stability in the long run is with a fiscal responsibility from the governments. It is not a surprise that I think most people in this panel will agree that the current levels of debt, of government debt, and of deficits is unsustainable. And the reality is that because of COVID, many of these policies were masked and were sold to the population as ways to mitigate the deficits or mitigate the external shock of COVID. But the reality is that all these were stimulus programs. If you see the size of the stimulus programs in the US was roughly 3 times the size of the downturn because of COVID. So these were not really measures to counteract COVID. It was really a Keynesian program approach. It was a Keynesian approach for stimulus. And this is something that we cannot agree. And the problem, what is the problem? The problem is that if you keep these fiscal levels and you keep raising interest rates, then really the only solution is to raise interest rates so much that then you have also financial constraints. You have some financial distress. And this is something that also worries me as well. I saw the speech from Lagarde a couple of days ago, in which she mentioned that she doesn't see any trade-off between monetary stability and financial stability. However, if you don't control the fiscal levels at the medium term, then the amount of pressure that you will put on banks is simply unsustainable. And we are seeing this in the last weeks, Credit Suisse, the Silicon Valley Bank. So I really believe that, yes, there is no trade-off, fiscal, financial stability and monetary stability, as long as you have the fiscal stability in check. We want people to have good education. We need growth. We want people to have a good pensions, good houses, a good standard of living. We need growth. We want to have democracy. We need to have economic prosperity. There is no other way. Why do we have these volatile systems in places like Latin America? It's because we have half of our population without any kind of economic inclusion. And we have not found ways to have economic systems that include them in our system. And these people then don't feel represented, and with reason, These people then see that they don't have enough money to retire, they don't have enough money for the education of their children, they don't have enough money for their houses, for feeding their families. So this kind of idea that we need to degrow, I believe, is the kind of idea that I see when I come to very rich countries. But when I'm in Latin America, or when I'm in African countries, or in developing countries, what people, the normal people, the people that I see in the supermarket, on the streets, what they tell me is, Jorge, how can we find ways to have economic growth, good jobs, prosperity? So I do believe that this notion that I see is extremely, extremely harmful for society, because without growth, there is no prosperity, there is no development. We do need to translate that growth into public services, into public goods, into integral kind of development. But to do that, we need economic growth. Yeah, I want to add really quick that if something that, if I can say something, is that every institution has to have its own mandate and objective. And in the case of the European institutions, there is something that we clearly see that is very worrisome, which is the politicization of some institutions. Coming back to the next generation EU funds, is that in order to give these funds, there should be some kind of criteria. And in fact, initially there was this criteria. They were going to give some specific grades to every country on specific parameters. And what they did is that they give the maximum grade in all aspects to all countries. What does this mean? Is that there was not really any kind of real assessment, but it was really a political kind of decision to just give out the funds without any kind of criteria. Those are the kind of things that you don't see in developed countries, because that's not the way that you do institution design.